The following is a special video presentation of the Hennepin County Library.
Welcome to a discussion with author Andrew Vachss. I'm Steve Benson. Andrew Vachss is an attorney in private practice specializing in cases of sexual abuse and child and juvenile justice. His most recent book is Down in the Zero, just published by Knopf. He's also the author of 8 other novels. Andrew, before we went on the air, you talked about the fact that some people say just emotional abuse, and yet for you, emotional abuse is one of the most powerful crimes.
I've been doing this for 30 years in any form you can think of. The difference between physical and sexual abuse and emotional abuse is that unlike physical or sexual abuse, which can be perceived, and properly so by the victim, as an attack by someone against them, the purpose of emotional abuse, it is specifically designed to make the victim smaller and smaller and smaller until they actually begin to feel that they deserve whatever misery was dumped on them. I'll give you one example, you'll see exactly what I mean. I know a woman who was a victim of forcible incest by her father for a number of years, 4 or 5 years. She finally got what it took to tell her mother. Her mother slapped her in the face and called her a whore. Years ago, she still remembers that as the worst thing that happened. Not the 5 years of torture at the hands of her father, but that her mother called her a slut and a whore, thereby making her the person to blame for all of this. And of course the mother's prophecy eventually came true.
In the work that you've done, you say that it's anger that fuels you, the rage. And when I was reading through the material, as well as reading the novel, talked about when you found a baby that had been forcibly raped.
Yeah, I don't know the limitations of your program, so I'll try and say, to the extent anyone could say such things euphemistically. But the gravamen of that case, what was so powerful about that case, was not finding a baby with syphilis. We've seen a lot of babies with syphilis. But that the perpetrator had gone to the emergency ward for treatment for himself because he'd lacerated his genitals horribly, raping this little baby. He left the baby at home. So you understand there the perfect sociopath. Regardless of what he did, he feels only his own pain and responds only to his own needs. That, in essence, is the predatory pedophile, who has been my enemy since that day.
You talk about 3 different types of abusers. Can you share that with our audience?
Sure. Type 1 is by far the biggest type. People who are simply inadequate as parents, don't know how to be parents. Prototypical example, a 12-year-old girl with a baby of her own. Really has had no training in parenting and mothering of any kind, and can't distinguish between this little thing that's supposed to comfort her like a doll and this little thing that needs her like a baby. For folks like that, rehabilitation, as it's commonly known, is unbelievably effective. It absolutely works. There are people who, if simply put in touch with what they're doing to their own children, stop, because it never was their intent. There's people who beat their kids every day as they were beaten and believe it made them a good citizen. You can combat virtually all of that, and quite well. The next category is considerably smaller. That's people who are crazy. Card carrying, crazy. Paranoid schizophrenic, crazy. Diagnosable, crazy. And so we're as good with them as psychiatry can take us, which means we have great luck with obsessive compulsives in terms of their parenting. We have lousy luck with paranoid schizophrenic. So far there's no argument between me and the establishment in social work and psychology, but the third category is where we part company. That's people who are evil. People who hurt children for their own pleasure and or their own profit. The kiddie pornographers, the incest perpetrators, the maggot that I just described earlier. Evil is a matter of choice. And if you say that someone was compelled by their background to be a serial killer or an arsonist who giggles at the flames, what you're doing is disrespecting the thousands and thousands of others who suffered worse and refused to imitate the oppressor. So evil comes down to choice.
And this, of course, is where you have to part company with some liberals that say that, well, anybody is rehabilitatable, or we can't kill these people somehow, they've been victims themselves.
Well, I don't think that's a liberal point of view. I think it's an ignorant point of view. I wouldn't put it any place on a political spectrum. Rehabilitation, his hand, it's been broken a lot, okay? It's rehabilitated. Put it in cast, they set it, maybe a little more crooked than it was, but it works again. It's returning to a state of former functioning. The people you're talking about confuse explanation with justification. I represent little children as abuse victims, and years later, those same children, still children, as perpetrators of crime. There's no question about the causal connection, but at some point, if we don't invoke the doctrine of responsibility, and we make everything that happens out here excusable, won't be many of us left. It's counter-Darwinistic to do that. As a species, we're not going to survive that way.
You talk about in the book that these are human carrion of a society in which Darwinian principles have been compressed to their logical extremes.
Yeah, well look, what distinguishes us from animals? Not our morality, but our intellect. And what happened is that our intellect evolved to the point where the other pieces of the species drive have eroded. You do my job long enough and you'll start to question whether there is a maternal instinct. Now, I'm not saying it's been bred out of the human race, but I am saying that our race doesn't work the same way other races work. For example, male bears will kill and eat cubs. The only protection the cubs have, their mother. Their mother will fight to protect the cubs. The mothers that successfully fight, it's their cubs carrying her genes that move on. It's not the way out here at all. And if we don't get a grip at some point about species survival, if we keep saying that someone who can sodomize 1,000 babies can be saved, if we take this huge amount of resources and throw it at a problem that nobody believes is really a problem. If you speak to a pedophile, a predatory pedophile, what he or she will say to you is, I'm simply a superior creature, in very Nietzschean terms. I'm not bound by your petty laws and your stupid morality. And so they have protective coloration, and they can talk nicely, and they can learn all the therapeutic language. The reality is they won't change because they like what they do.
And this is what this novel, Down the Zero, is about: people who like what they do and people who make money out of it. Absolutely.
In fact, the most horrible thing to consider about phenomenon such as snuff films or torture of baby films is not that they occur, but that there's a market for it. What happens with markets is organized crime steps in to fill it. So it used to be, for example, if you're one of these freaks, I don't have a better word for it, take a Polaroid picture of someone doing something sexual to your kid and you could pass it around. That's as far as you would go. The market's so huge now, and I don't mean width, I just mean depth. So that's the phenomenon. One pedophile would consume any and all material that you could make at your own hands or at a country's hands if he or she had the resources. So it's very different from a drug addict. It's very different from a gun collector, an armed robber, anything you want to look at. These people are special. And what's special about them is they can only multiply by infecting others.
There was a very appalling ad that you have in your novel, and it's someone who begins with a biblical quote.
Yeah. Although I want to be very, very clear to the people who are watching us, I didn't make up that ad. I obtained that ad in an underground freak sheet. If I had a prayer, it would be that what I write is fiction. And when I started, people saw it that way. Nobody sees that anymore. You'd have to be brain damaged to know that our children aren't being eaten alive. The ad said, I think it was Proverbs 13:24, the famous spare the rod proverb, which justifies in the minds of some people their own sexual entertainment. What the ad said was, next time your child has a good whipping coming, I'll pay $50 for an audio tape or $100 of a videotape of that. If you think about how foul that is, and its intent is clearly pornographic, but at the same time it sounds legal, and right now it probably is. A man was just convicted in Santa Barbara on the West Coast. What he did was he built a room in his basement that was soundproofed, and he would take his step-niece down there for discipline. And the child was whipped with a variety of objects over a period of time, made to strip, all that sort of stuff. When he was caught, he pleaded guilty. He said, I absolutely abused the child. It's child abuse. Give me the 6 months in jail. The task was to prove that what he did was for his own sexual gratification, because at no time did he actually interact with the child physically except to beat her. What saved the day and what got him the 100 years in jail was the videotapes he made of it. It was very tough to explain to a jury why you make videotapes of disciplining a child. And in fact, he couldn't, and now he's away. That's what this book about. This book, although the language is heavily sexual, and although it takes place essentially in the S&M underground, it's about emotional abuse of children by treating them as objects, and very low objects at that.
Back to our first comment that emotional abuse is perhaps the most horrendous of all crimes.
If you look at the teenagers who commit suicide, the cluster suicides you see sometimes, the ones I've looked at, they don't seem to indicate physical or sexual abuse as a propelling factor, but emotional abuse, absolutely. And that's part of the plot here, too. We have cluster suicide running throughout the book.
You mentioned earlier the traffic in child pornography. Years ago in Scandinavia, it was available out on the streets because it was supposedly a healthy outlet.
Yeah. Well, we all know about the healthy outlet thing. The interesting thing about pornography is it doesn't do what either the liberals or the conservatives think. Kiddie pornography does not stimulate a pedophile. He doesn't need to look at this and say, oh, now I have an idea. It does two things. And this is what investigators know that the government appears not to. The first thing it does is it validates. I see people doing this to children. I'm not so outside the herd. I'm more normal. These people simply have a sexual preference like me. So you don't self-visualize as sick or perverted as evil, but as one of many. The second issue is to desensitize. When pedophiles hunt, they don't generally do it by jumping out of trees with stocking masks. I mean, some of them do it, but by and large, they use camouflage. They work their way in. And when they work their way in, and anytime you see a pedophile's house, you'll see video game machines and sports equipment, all kinds of stuff that kids like. You'll see the porn. And the purpose of the kiddie porn is so that the other kids, seeing it, especially watching it on video because they've been raised in this country to believe that video is the truth, it drops their inhibitional threshold when they see others. It's insane for this country to say, well, peer pressure is something we have to fight. But when it comes to predatory pedophiles and kiddie pornography, they don't seem to recognize that the victims on the screen are the peers of the children watching.
And that often the perpetrators are people in positions of trust. A famous case in the Twin Cities some years ago we won't go into was a person of very prominent status who was responsible and was like a Pied Piper for children.
Pedophiles are wonderful hunters. They have skill level that you wouldn't believe. I've stood with them and watched inside a window where children are playing. They just watch. So they can almost inevitably pick out the child that's ignored at home, bullied at home, sad, missing parent, foster kid, whatever. They're really, really good at it because their essential means of hunting is camouflage. They come to you as school bus drivers or bus scout leaders or priests or rabbis or Little League coaches, but they get close to children and then they watch very carefully and take their time. That's why the median pedophile who's been sentenced to prison has acknowledged more than 100 prior offenses before the catching.
And you believe that there is really no rehabilitation for pedophiles?
How do you rehabilitate? Well, pedophiles, sure, not predatory pedophiles. The distinction is as follows. If they feel the feelings that they want to have sex with children, sure, you can do that. If they've acted on those feelings, no. Unless, I suppose I could hypothesize somebody acting on the feelings and feeling disgusted. We don't see it. Well, I'll ask you this. You have AA groups in the city, right? You have groups where if you're drug addicted, you could go for help. Whether you're an overeater, you could go for help. Virtually any kind of problem. There's never been, to my knowledge, a predatory pedophile who walked in seeking help. They come in handcuffs seeking help. They go before the parole board seeking help. They tell a judge that they need help. But prior to the capture, you never hear a word from them.
In the international sex trade now, there are certain places that supposedly it was all right, Thailand, places in South America, but now governments are recognizing the fact that their citizens ought to have a responsibility even if they're in another country.
Some governments. Australia has just passed a law that would criminalize sexual conduct with a child outside its shores if committed by a citizen. Such laws are being considered in Germany and, as a matter of fact, in Scandinavia. There has been a law that sort of would do that, introduced several years ago that nobody ever heard of in this country, and nobody supported it. The reason is that there's no organization around such issues. And I'll explain what I mean. There's two myths that predominate in the Orient, two sexual myths. One is powdered rhino horn, will make you virile again, and one is sex with a child will make you virile again. As to the rhino, we have economic and trade sanctions against countries that deal with this stuff. We have enormous fines, we have jail sentences, we have a public education program, and they shoot poachers on sight. What about the other myth? Who's refusing to do business with Thailand because they sell their children? Nobody. There's no economic boycott, no trade sanctions, no nothing, and we sure as hell not shooting them on sight.
And certainly even in cases in this country, these are the people who don't vote. They're usually, as you say, their self-esteem is diminished to the point of non-existence practically, so that there's no lobby.
It's the opposite of a lobby. Pedophiles have better lobbies than children in this country. Pedophiles have public action committees, they raise funds, they back candidates, not overtly like saying we're the candidate of the child molesters, but they absolutely do that. In this country, not voting is not the real problem for kids. The real problem is that nobody has adopted kids as their constituency. Do you think the NRA is composed of geniuses who figured out all the labyrinth of legislation? No, it's composed of people who have one issue, and one issue makes you powerful. What they say to the government is, I don't give a damn about abortion, I don't care. I don't care about children, I don't care about trees, I don't care about whales. I don't care about interstate commerce, I don't care about the FCC, I care about my damn guns. And if you're opposed to my guns, I'm opposed to you. It's extremely effective. Who's saying that about children? Instead you have these pompous windbags. It takes 4 hours to give you meaningless statistics about why we should do something about children. Everybody's turned off the TV and gone to sleep.
And family values.
Family values. Dan Quayle's running around screaming he has family values, right? If I were him, I would have family values too, because given his other attributes, I think that he would not have reached the station in life he has but for his family. And I think that family is valuable to him.
That's a quote out of your book, or at least a paraphrase of one of the characters.
Well, these people speak for me. I mean, I'm not pretending it to be otherwise. But sure, I think this country doesn't define family operationally. And I'll prove it to you. If a man has sex with a 6-year-old child down the street, he's a pervert. You want to put him in prison. But if it's his own 6-year-old child, you say it's family dysfunction. So you call in the therapists. Incest is a crime for which almost nobody goes to prison. Why is that? You get a bonus for growing your own victim? And think about that. Because there's no lobby whatsoever. The lowest maggot of a child molester can vote, and the most innocent child cannot. Because when you talk to liberals, they've got such a spread of concerns that they're focused on none of them. I'm not mad as people think I am with the animal rights people. I respect them. My hat's off to them. They don't have to have my issue, but their issue they did something about. I mean, it's much more risky to kill a rhino now than to sodomize a baby. Instead of getting mad at the people who've made it harder to kill rhinos, we need to be saying, why are we not emulating their tactics and their success?
Another part of this dark side is, we've talked about this, that there are threats against you. I mean, you write about these things.
Sure.
You would think that people would be appalled and, what can I do? No, you get death threats.
Well, I get many more letters from people who are positively accessed by this stuff. But yes, especially this last book, it really seems to have punched people's buttons. And I'll give you an example. In one day's mail, there's a lot of letters, but in one day's mail, I got 2 letters that stand out. One was from a woman who's a working prostitute, who in effect said, I understand now how I ended up this way. The next letter was from a man named Joel Rifkin, America's most prolific serial killer of prostitutes, who's now incarcerated, who said now he understands why he did what he did. The tragedy is that the vicious, monstrous son of a bitch doesn't realize he's killing his own sisters. And they came from exactly the same root of torture. And one chose to imitate the oppressor, and one chose to take the self-esteem and say, I'm nothing. But it was the same original impact which caused that spread.
In this book, you have 2 sisters, Fancy and Charm.
Yeah.
Tell about the dynamics that led them to...
They're twins, but not identical twins. And interestingly enough, Charm, who everybody thought was this well-integrated, intelligent, career-oriented person, was an incest victim. Fancy was simply beaten by her father to stimulate himself, at which point he would take Charm someplace. Fancy actually felt worse. Fancy actually felt, as a child, feels not as a grown woman, that Charm was her father's favorite. So she was beaten because she was bad, and Charm was made love to because Charm was good.
So again, back to what you're saying, that even though there's no physicality,
right,
that was emotional abuse that was the most crippling.
There was plenty of physicality with Charm, who had sex with her father for years. There was plenty of physicality for Fancy, who got beaten all the time. But neither of them responded in the pathological way they ended up because of that. They responded because of the emotional abuse. look, there's only 3 laws that could possibly govern us, right? We can have the laws of nature, the laws that we humans make, or the laws of whatever God you believe in. Come down any place on those 3 or all 3, and they are violated by a human being using his child for his own pleasure, sexually, physically, whatever. They're all violated. The recognition that they've been violated says to the child, you must be lower than other humans because everybody else I see loves their kids. So instead of saying it's my parents who are evil, it's me, I'm garbage.
Yeah.
And it happens all the time.
Yeah, there's a terrible passage about where you talk about a small child who goes up and fondles the genitals of any male, saying, isn't that what daddy's like?
That happened to me in court. That happened to me when I met a 5-year-old girl in court on an emergency removal. The social worker said, that's your client. And I said, hi, like that. The little girl ran over, jumped in my lap, put one little arm around my neck, grabbed my genitals, and squeezed. And, I was really shocked. So what are you doing? She said, all daddy's like that. You're not going to hurt me, are you? How much of a psychiatrist would you have to be? How much anecdotal evidence do you have to see? How many babies, if you go like this, they duck, do you have to see to know it's not the baby? The processing has been altered forever by the early chronic abuse. And emotional abuse tends to be the most chronic, unremitting of all.
Your novels also have a coldness and a chill. Mm-hmm. It's Burke, and I want to ask a bit more about Burke, but this man, in a sense, who understands these people, yet tries not to empathize with them.
Oh, he understands them perfectly. He doesn't empathize with them at all, but he hates them. His hatred is absolutely over-the-top, red zone pathological. Burke is not, well, I don't want to compare him to any other people in literature. He's a career criminal. He's a mercenary. He's not Philip Marlowe. He's not a guy with a white hat. He's a person who has no respect for law and seeks only to survive. The only time he gets involved in something like this is when his country is invaded. And his country consists of about 10 square feet around him and his family of choice, not his biological family, but the family he formed out of his own desperation, and they in turn with him. This is a person who's very, very dangerous because his own feelings are always at risk. So he tries to keep them suppressed and tries to stay as icy cold as he possibly can. If he worships a god, it's ice, but he's not always faithful to it.
Talk about your own background in terms of, obviously there's not a one-to-one correlation between you and Burke,
right.
But the fact that there's been a lot of pain and alienation in your own life.
I was a federal investigator in sexually transmitted diseases, which is where I first saw people hurt babies. I was a caseworker in New York City. I was in Biafra during that stupid war. I ran a reentry center for ex-convicts, a community center in Uptown in Chicago, and finally a maximum security prison for people under 21. The sum total of all that is such that I thought I had learned things of great value. And I thought if I shared them, change could be made, which is the arrogance of youth. So I wrote a book. Not any of these books. I wrote a very carefully crafted book about juvenile violence with thousands of footnotes and 40 or 50 interviews with some of the scariest young people you'll ever seen. Everything from floor plans to how they can make prisons safer. It got wonderful reviews. In fact, it probably got the best reviews of anything I've written, but it never got outside of academia.
You said half a dozen people read it.
Right, and they all loved it. Yeah, that's exactly right. You can still find it in the criminology libraries, but in terms of polluting the jury pool, in terms of getting what I believe I can prove is the truth out to numbers of people, nonfiction wasn't going to do it. That's why I turned to the novels. I never would have dreamed that, in 17 different languages I could talk to the people. But as we were saying before the show, it is a Trojan horse. I have to get inside the palace gates and get someone to open it, which means they have to be books. And they have to have a certain amount of narrative force, a certain ability to engage, or any message I've got is going to be lost.
And for people reading the books, I'm sure that many of them say, well, this can't possibly happen, but it comes right out of your files.
Yeah, and they're not saying that anymore.
Mm-hmm.
The truth is when I started writing, I got such a graphic lesson in that. I was real excited because the British had also bought my book, and I went over there. And the first interview was a guy who said, how can you make this filthy stuff up? What kind of a fevered, sick imagination do you have? And I tried to, this was my first book, I tried to really be sort of polite, thinking that was the way to go, but it didn't work. I had occasion to return to London 3-4 years later. The day I returned, a little boy whose name I'll never forget, Jason Swift, the people who killed him were found guilty. They had video sodomized the child to death. Stood around, watched the child be attacked as he was dying, and filmed it. I saw the report. It was a moment where I said, how could you make this stuff up? And that was the end of that discussion. When I started writing about this, it couldn't get published. I had about 15 years worth of rejection because everybody said just that. Unfortunately, horribly, public consciousness has caught up. When I wrote in Sacrifice about a 10-year-old committing a murder, some idiot said that can't happen. Well, of course we knew not only it could, but it already had. If I had a prayer, it would be that the books are fiction, that I made this stuff up. Indeed, in some ways, the books are actually toned down, euphemized. So there's a way to get past the absolute disgust barrier in people.
What do you want to see happen in our society?
I want to see us begin to fight for our survival as a species. So the first step was the Oprah bill, that after years we got passed last year, which is a national registry of all those convicted of crimes against children, so that they no longer rape a baby in Illinois, move to Indiana and get a job in a daycare center. So that's number one. Number two, we have a program now called Civitas, C-I-V-I-T-A-S. It started at Loyola of Chicago Law School in the Child Law Center. So no more courses about child abuse. There's a full curriculum about child advocacy. It's now at Baylor. There's a Department of Child Traumatology, and at the University of Michigan, which is the Department of Social Work. And the advocates we're training cross-train. So unlike coming out now where you haven't got a clue as to how to cross-examine a doctor, even to talk to one, they'll be prepared. And unlike doctors who graduate and have no experience with court, they'll be prepared. That's the next wave of what we're trying to do. But what I want is for people to get into triage. I want people to look at criminal offenders and say, we can save this one, he's worth all our resources. We can't save this one, I don't mean kill him. I mean stop this endless cycle of go in, go out, go in, go out. Minneapolis, Minnesota, I should say, did an incredible piece, I think it was in 1991, Free to Rape, very carefully tracking sex offenders who went to prison, tracking the therapies they got, and tracking the results. And concluded, as I and most people at Ground Zero have long since concluded, that you don't impact the behavior of such people with therapy at all. If you raise the stakes high enough, you could impact them with deterrence.
Thank you very much for talking with us today.
My pleasure.
Andrew Vachss is an attorney in private practice. He also is a novelist, and his most recent novel is Down on the Zero, published by Knopf. I'm Steve Benson.
A presentation of the Hennepin County Library.